The vampire king was alone in his private elevator when Arya stumbled in, fleeing her abusive ex. Her tear-streaked face made his dead heart clench. Until that moment, he'd never understood why his kind spoke of mates. Now her broken sob was unraveling centuries of careful control, and he'd kill anyone who made her cry again. The vampire king Darius Blackthorn had built his empire one calculated acquisition at a time, his fingers wrapped around Manhattan's throat through 6 centuries of patient maneuvering, and tonight, the penthouse elevator that carried him to his glass kingdom felt like the only sanctuary left in a world that had grown too small for his ancient hungers. The mirrored walls reflected his perfect stillness, the kind of motionless grace that came from decades of practice at appearing human. But the reflection was wrong somehow, translucent and ghostly, a reminder that he existed between worlds without truly belonging to either. He pressed the button for the 58th floor with hands that hadn't trembled in 300 years, his mind already cataloging the evening's disappointments. Another business dinner where he'd pushed food around his plate and smiled at jokes that weren't funny. Another performance of mortality that left him hollow and restless. The elevator doors began their whispered close when something crashed through them with desperate violence, a blur of midnight hair and torn silk that collided with his chest and sent his carefully controlled world spinning into chaos. Arya Chen hit him like a meteor strike, her designer dress hanging in elegant tatters from one shoulder, mascara painting dark rivers down cheeks that should have been luminous under gallery lights, but instead bore the shadow map of fear and betrayal. She smelled like expensive perfume and terror sweat, like the art gallery where she'd spent her evening authenticating masterpieces only to discover that the man she'd trusted with her body and her professional reputation had been selling forgeries through her recommendations for months. The elevator's motion sensor caught her stumbling entrance, and the doors sealed with a soft pneumatic sigh that sounded like a trap closing. And Darius felt his pupils dilate as her pulse hammered against his superhuman hearing like the most intoxicating music ever composed. He hadn't fed properly in weeks, sustaining himself on bagged blood and sheer willpower to maintain the illusion of humanity his business empire demanded, but her heartbeat was a symphony that threatened to shatter centuries of self-control. The elevator stopped between floors with a subtle jolt that she didn't notice, but he had caused with the barest flexing of supernatural will, his ancient instincts recognizing prey even as his rational mind catalogued the danger she represented to everything he'd built. Arya pressed herself against the mirrored wall, her breath coming in shallow gasps that made her chest rise and fall in a rhythm that hypnotized him. And when she whispered broken apologies for her intrusion, he caught the scent of salt tears and something deeper, something that made his dead heart clench with an emotion he hadn't felt since his mortal death. She noticed his reflection then, the way it wavered like smoke in the elevator's perfect mirrors, and her breath caught in a sound that was part gasp and part recognition. But instead of the screaming terror he expected, her dark eyes filled with something that looked almost like relief. The pull between them was immediate and inexplicable, a magnetic force that had nothing to do with his vampire nature and everything to do with something far more dangerous than mere predator and prey. Arya straightened against the wall, her torn dress sliding further off one shoulder to reveal a collarbone that gleamed like porcelain under the elevator's harsh lighting. And when their eyes met in the mirror's reflection, he saw not fear, but a desperate kind of hope that made him want to tear apart whoever had put that expression on her face. Darius had perfected the art of appearing harmless over 6 centuries of existence, but now his carefully constructed mask cracked as protective fury flooded his system, his fangs extending slightly as his pupils dilated to full black. He spoke for the first time since she'd crashed into his sanctuary, his voice emerging as velvet over steel, smooth and cultured but carrying undertones that promised violence to anyone who threatened what was his. "He hurt you." The words weren't a question because the evidence was written in every line of her body, in the way she held herself like something fragile and damaged, in the tear tracks that streaked her makeup and the defensive curl of her shoulders. Arya nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion that sent her hair cascading over her injured shoulder, and when she spoke, her voice carried the professional composure of someone who spent her days evaluating priceless art, but had discovered that the man she'd been sleeping with had been using her expertise to authenticate forgeries worth millions. Marcus Whitmore had played her perfectly, she whispered into the elevator's humming silence, their relationship a carefully orchestrated con that had lasted 8 months and nearly destroyed her career in one evening when she'd discovered his network of fake masterpieces bearing her authentication. The vampire rule of sanctuary was older than human civilization, a law written in blood and magic that bound his kind to protect those who sought refuge, and Darius felt the ancient compulsion settle over him like armor as he recognized what she represented. She was under his protection now, whether she knew it or not, whether she wanted it or not, and the very air around them seemed to thicken with supernatural promise as that recognition took hold. Marcus's voice echoed from the lobby 57 floors below, his tone carrying the entitled rage of a man who wasn't used to being denied anything he wanted, demanding that building security send the elevator down immediately because his girlfriend was having a breakdown and needed his help. The sound reached them through the building's ventilation system with crystalline clarity, thanks to Darius's supernatural hearing, and Arya flinched as though the words were physical blows, her body curling further into the corner as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. The scent of her fear sweat sharpened, underlaid now with the copper tang of blood where she'd bitten her lip, and Darius felt his fangs extend fully as ancient predatory instincts warred with something far more complex and dangerous. The elevator lurched slightly as his supernatural control wavered, the machinery responding to emotions he'd kept buried for decades. And when Arya's terrified gaze met his in the mirror's reflection, he made a choice that would change everything. His fangs were fully visible now, sharp and gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lighting, impossible to mistake for anything human, and he waited for her to scream or faint or collapse into the hysterical terror that should have been her natural response to discovering she was trapped with a predator. Instead, she stared at his reflection with something that looked like wonder, her pupils dilating not with fear, but with an inexplicable attraction that made his centuries-old heart stutter back to something resembling life. The elevator began its descent toward the lobby, where Marcus waited with building security and probably backup plans that would put her in more danger than she could imagine, and Darius made a decision that violated every survival instinct he'd honed over 600 years of existence. He extended one perfectly manicured hand toward her, his skin pale as marble but warm with stolen life, and when he spoke his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty that came from commanding armies and building empires. "Trust me," he said, and watched something shift in her dark eyes, some fundamental recognition that what she was feeling wasn't fear, but the pull of something far more dangerous than mere physical attraction. She reached out with trembling fingers and placed her hand in his, her skin burning against his supernatural cold, and the contact sent electricity racing through his entire system like lightning finding its conductor. The elevator doors would open in 30 seconds to reveal whatever trap Marcus had prepared. But in that moment, suspended between floors, Darius felt something he'd thought lost forever stir in the hollow space where his heart used to beat. Arya's pulse hammered against his superhuman senses like a war drum, calling him to battle, her scent wrapping around him like silk and steel. And when she smiled at him through her tears, it was like watching the sun rise after 6 centuries of endless night. The building's security system registered their descent, but Darius had already begun planning their escape, his mind calculating exit routes and contingencies, while his body responded to her proximity with an intensity that threatened to shatter his carefully maintained control. Whatever happened next, whatever dangers awaited them in the lobby below, The woman whose hand trembled in his was under his protection now, and he would move heaven and earth to keep her safe from the man who had dared to hurt what belonged to him. The elevator doors slid open with a whisper of expensive machinery, revealing Marcus pacing the marble lobby like a caged predator, his face twisted with the kind of rage that made Arya's stomach clench with familiar dread. Building security flanked him, two thick-necked men in crisp uniforms who looked uncomfortable with whatever story he'd spun about his missing girlfriend. But before Marcus could spot her cowering behind the Vampire King's broad shoulders, Darius stepped forward with the fluid grace of an apex predator claiming territory. The transformation was instant and absolute, where moments before he'd been gentle, almost vulnerable in the elevator's intimate confines. Now he radiated the kind of power that made lesser men step back without understanding why. His presence filled the lobby like smoke from an ancient fire, commanding attention from every soul within 50 feet. Marcus turned toward the elevator, mouth already opening to unleash whatever venom he'd prepared, but the words died on his tongue as Darius fixed him with a stare that could have frozen blood in veins. The Vampire King said nothing, simply stood there in his perfectly tailored suit, hands clasped behind his back, and somehow that silence carried more menace than any threat. Security Chief Reynolds approached with the deference of a man who recognized money and danger in equal measure. Darius leaned close, whispered something that made Reynolds nod quickly, then gestured toward Marcus with the casual authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Whatever passed between them lasted mere seconds, but Arya watched Marcus's face cycle through confusion, anger, and finally fear as Reynolds and his partner approached. The security chief's voice carried across the lobby with professional courtesy wrapped around steel. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises. Building management has received complaints about harassment." Marcus sputtered protests, his face flushing red as he jabbed a finger toward the elevator. "That's my girlfriend. She's obviously in distress. Some stranger probably kidnapped her." The absurdity of it might have been funny under different circumstances. Here was Marcus, who'd spent 3 years systematically destroying her confidence, suddenly playing the concerned boyfriend for an audience. But Reynolds simply shook his head, one hand resting meaningfully on his radio. "The lady in question appeared to be leaving voluntarily with Mr. Blackthorne, and we have strict policies about domestic disputes. Perhaps you should contact the police if you believe a crime has been committed." The threat hung in the air like incense, heavy and choking. Marcus knew as well as Arya did that involving police would expose his own crimes, the forged documents, the stolen art, the web of lies he'd built around their relationship. His jaw worked silently for a moment, before he spun on his heel and stalked toward the exit, but not before shooting one last look at the elevator that promised this wasn't finished. Darius waited until the glass doors closed behind him before turning back to Arya, and she was struck again by the way his presence seemed to shift, like light through prisms. The dangerous king dissolved back into the man who'd held her hand in an elevator, whose touch had made her feel safer than she'd felt in years. "Are you all right?" His voice was soft velvet again, concerned rather than commanding. Arya found herself nodding even as her hands shook with delayed reaction. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving her feeling hollowed out and strange. "How did you do that?" She gestured toward the now empty lobby. One word to security and he just left. Darius studied her face with those impossibly dark eyes, and she had the unsettling feeling he was seeing far more than she intended to show. "Let's just say I've learned the value of making the right connections over the years." His smile was enigmatic, holding secrets she couldn't begin to guess at. "Would you like me to take you somewhere safe?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither of them was ready to name. Every rational part of Arya's mind screamed warnings. This man was a stranger, dangerous in ways she couldn't define, and following him anywhere defied every rule of self-preservation she'd learned in 28 years of careful living. But rationality had never made her pulse race the way his proximity did. had never made her skin feel electrified by the mere possibility of touch. Something about him called to a part of herself she'd forgotten existed, the woman who'd once dreamed of grand adventures instead of settling for Marcus's safe mediocrity. Yes, she heard herself say, the word emerging before conscious thought could stop it. I'd like that very much. The smile that spread across Darius's face was like sunrise after the longest winter, warming something deep in her chest that had been frozen for years. He offered his arm with old-world courtesy, and she slipped her hand through the crook of his elbow, feeling the solid strength of muscle beneath expensive wool. His skin was cool even through the fabric, but somehow that detail felt right, as if warmth would have been wrong for a creature who moved through shadows with such predatory grace. They walked through Manhattan's glittering evening streets, past restaurants where beautiful people picked at overpriced salads and bars where young professionals drowned their disappointments in craft cocktails. But Darius led her away from the obvious destinations, down a narrow alley that looked like it belonged in another century. Gas lamps flickered against brick walls worn smooth by decades of weather, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their flames. At the alley's end stood an unremarkable door, heavy oak bound with iron that had aged to deep patina. No sign marked the entrance, no indication that anything lay beyond except storage or service spaces. Darius pressed his palm against a section of wood that looked identical to the rest, and Arya heard the soft click of expensive locks disengaging. The door opened onto a narrow staircase descending into warm golden light, and the scent that rose to meet them was intoxicating. Aged whiskey and wood smoke, old books and something else, something that made her mouth water despite having no name for it. She followed him down stone steps worn smooth by countless feet, emerging into a space that defied every law of architecture and probability. The room stretched impossibly far in every direction, as if the modest building above contained acres of hidden space. Warm light emanated from sources she couldn't identify, casting everything in the golden glow of perpetual sunset. Leather banquettes lined the walls, surrounding intimate tables where patrons spoke in hushed voices over drinks that sparkled like liquid jewels. A bar dominated one wall, its mirror backing reflecting rows of bottles that seemed to contain more than mere alcohol. Some glowed with their own inner light, others swirled with colors that hurt to look at directly. The bartender moved with inhuman fluidity, pouring drinks from vessels that occasionally steamed or sparked. But it was the patrons themselves that made Arya's breath catch in her throat. They looked human at first glance, beautiful people in expensive clothes enjoying an evening out. But shadows fell wrong around them. Reflections appeared where they shouldn't, and failed to appear where they should. The woman in the corner booth cast no shadow at all, while her companion's silhouette stretched and writhed independently of his movements. A group near the bar laughed at some shared joke, and their eyes flashed colors that existed nowhere in nature. Darius guided her to a secluded booth in the back corner, his hand warm against the small of her back as he helped her settle onto leather that felt older than the building above. A server appeared instantly, a pale young man whose smile revealed teeth just slightly too sharp to be entirely human. The usual, Mr. Blackthorne? And for the lady? Champagne, Darius said without consulting her. The Cristal, 1996. The server nodded and glided away, moving through the crowded room without seeming to touch the floor. This is impossible, Arya whispered, staring at a painting on the near wall that definitely hadn't been there when they sat down. The image showed a moonlit forest where shadows moved between trees that grew in patterns too perfect for nature. Darius followed her gaze and smiled, the expression holding secrets that stretched back centuries. The world is much larger than most people imagine. Sometimes impossible is just another word for misunderstood. The champagne arrived in crystal flutes that sang softly when touched, the wine inside sparkling with light that had nothing to do with carbonation. Arya sipped and tasted starlight, liquid music that danced across her tongue like poetry made manifest. Who are you? The question emerged unbidden, carrying all her confusion and growing fascination. Darius considered this as he studied the golden liquid in his glass, and she noticed he hadn't actually drunk any. Someone who appreciates beauty when he finds it. Someone who has learned the value of protecting rare and precious things. His gaze met hers across the small table, and the intensity there made her pulse quicken. Someone who hasn't felt truly alive in longer than you could possibly imagine, until a beautiful woman stumbled into my elevator running from a man too stupid to recognize the treasure he possessed. The words hit her like physical touches, warming places inside her chest that Marcus had systematically frozen over years of calculated cruelty. "You don't know me," she protested weakly. "I could be anyone, anything. I could be exactly as worthless as he always said." The pain in her own voice surprised her, the way 3 years of systematic emotional abuse had burrowed so deep she still believed its lies even when evidence contradicted them. Darius reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the contact sending electricity shooting up her arm. His skin was cool, but somehow comforting, and she realized she felt safer in this impossible place with this dangerous stranger than she'd felt anywhere in years. Worthless? His voice carried barely controlled fury, though she sensed instinctively that the anger wasn't directed at her. The man who convinced you of that is a fool who wouldn't recognize value if it bit him. You're extraordinary, Arya Chen, and I suspect you've forgotten how to see yourself clearly. The sound of her name on his lips made her shiver, though she couldn't remember telling him what it was. There was something hypnotic about the way he spoke, as if words carried more weight in his mouth than they did for ordinary people. "How do you know my name?" He smiled, and this time the expression held a hint of something predatory, though still warm. "I make it my business to know things about people who interest me. And you, my dear, are perhaps the most interesting person I've encountered in a very long time." The evening dissolved into conversation that flowed like the impossible champagne, topics ranging from art to philosophy to travel stories that seemed to span more years than any normal lifetime should contain. Darius spoke of places and times with the casual familiarity of someone who'd been there personally, describing Renaissance Italy as if he'd walked those streets, discussing the French Revolution like he'd witnessed the fall of kings. His knowledge was encyclopedic and strangely personal, filled with details that existed in no history book. The champagne made her bold, made her lean closer across the intimate table until she could catch his scent. He smelled like expensive cologne, and something else, something darker and more primal that made her think of midnight forests and ancient secrets. "When did you live in Paris?" The question emerged before she could consider its implications. His hand stilled against his glass, and for a moment something flickered across his face too quickly for her to interpret. "A long time ago," he said finally. "Long enough that the city was very different then. Smaller, more intimate. You could know everyone who mattered, and secrets were currency more valuable than gold." There was something in his voice, a weight of memory that suggested he wasn't speaking metaphorically. Arya found herself studying his face in the golden light, noting the perfection of bone structure that belonged on classical sculptures, the way shadows fell differently across his features, as if light itself bent around him. "You're not like other men," she said, the words emerging with wine-loosened honesty. "There's something about you that's dangerous and beautiful and impossible all at once. I should be terrified of you. Instead, I feel safer than I've felt in years. Why is that?" His eyes darkened to something deeper than midnight, and when he leaned closer she could see her own reflection in their depths, small and bright like a star in an endless sky. "Because you recognize something in me that calls to something in you," he said softly. "Because some connections transcend logic or safety, or all the careful rules we use to protect ourselves from getting hurt." His thumb traced across her knuckles, such a simple touch, that somehow felt more intimate than anything Marcus had ever done to her body. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing is also exactly what we need. The spell of the moment shattered like crystal when a new figure approached their table, moving with the same inhuman grace as the servers, but carrying himself with obvious authority. He was tall and lean with silver hair and eyes like winter storms, beautiful in the way of sharp edges and bitter cold. Victor, Darius's voice carried warning and something else, annoyance at the interruption perhaps. What couldn't wait? The newcomer leaned close, speaking in urgent whispers that carried just far enough for Arya to catch fragments. Silver dawn, he said, and connections, and surveillance. Darius's face went carefully blank as he listened, but she saw the way his free hand clenched into a fist on the table's surface. When Victor finished speaking, he straightened and offered Arya a smile that didn't quite reach those winter eyes. My apologies for the interruption, Miss Chen. I'm Victor Kozlov, Mr. Blackthorn's assistant and oldest. Friend, it's a pleasure to finally meet you. Finally? Arya glanced between the two men, noting the way they communicated in looks and subtle gestures like people who'd known each other for decades. How long have you known about me? Darius and Victor exchanged another of those loaded glances before Darius sighed and finished his champagne in one long swallow. That's rather complicated, he said, standing and offering her his hand. And I'm afraid our evening here has just been cut short. There are things we need to discuss, but not here. Not anymore. The warmth had drained from his voice, replaced by something hard and focused that reminded her exactly how dangerous he could be. Will you come with me? One more time, I promise you'll be safe. Arya looked around the impossible club, at the patrons with their wrong shadows and glowing drinks, at Victor whose stillness suggested coiled violence barely held in check. Every instinct screamed that she was stepping deeper into something far beyond her understanding, something that would change everything about the safe, predictable life she'd built for herself. But when she looked back at Darius, at the way he watched her with an intensity that made her feel like the only person in the world, the choice felt inevitable. Yes, she said, placing her hand in his. Whatever this is, wherever you're taking me, yes. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The penthouse elevator rose through the building's steel and glass spine, like blood through arteries, carrying them toward revelations that would reshape everything Arya thought she knew about herself and the world. Darius stood beside her in the mirrored cage, his reflection ghostly and translucent, while hers blazed with ordinary mortal solidity, and she found herself staring at the contrast between them with growing understanding of what it meant. The elevator's ascent felt like ascending into another realm entirely, leaving behind the mundane world where art forgeries were the worst betrayals she could imagine and entering something far more dangerous and beautiful. When the doors whispered open onto his private domain, Arya stepped into a space that defied every expectation she might have harbored about vampire lairs or billionaire penthouses. The apartment stretched across the entire top floor of the building, walls of floor-to-ceiling glass offering a view of Manhattan that made her feel like she was floating above the city in a crystal palace suspended between earth and stars. The decor spoke of centuries rather than decades, antique furniture that belonged in museums arranged with the casual elegance of someone who had acquired these pieces when they were new. Persian rugs that had walked beneath the feet of kings lay scattered across polished hardwood floors that gleamed like dark water, while original paintings by masters she recognized lined the walls between towering bookshelves that reached toward a ceiling lost in shadow. The space felt alive with history, every object carrying the weight of stories she could only guess at, and when she turned to comment on the incredible collection, she found Darius watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "You're not running," he said, and there was wonder in his voice, as if her continued presence defied some fundamental law of nature. Most humans who discover what I am either flee screaming or faint from shock. You're examining my library like you're planning to spend the evening reading. Arya moved toward the nearest bookshelf, drawn by titles in languages she couldn't identify, and books bound in leather that looked older than printing itself. Some of the volumes seemed to glow with their own inner light, while others appeared to shift and change when she wasn't looking directly at them. The scent that rose from the shelves was intoxicating. Aged parchment and ink mixed with something else that made her head swim with possibilities she couldn't name. "Why would I run?" she asked, trailing her fingers along the spine of a book that felt warm to the touch despite the apartment's cool air. "You saved me from Marcus tonight, protected me from whatever trap he had waiting downstairs, brought me to the most beautiful place I've ever seen. The fact that you're not entirely human doesn't change any of that. If anything, it explains why I felt that impossible connection the moment I crashed into your elevator." She turned to face him, noting the way he stood perfectly still in the center of his domain like a statue carved from marble and shadow. There was something predatory in his stillness, but also something vulnerable, as if her acceptance meant more to him than he knew how to express. Darius moved toward her with that fluid grace she was beginning to recognize as distinctly inhuman, closing the distance between them until she could see the way his pupils dilated in response to her proximity. When she'd cut her finger on the antique letter opener, his reaction had been immediate and visceral, fangs extending as the scent of her blood filled the air between them. But instead of the violence she should have expected from a creature of legend, he'd shown her gentleness that bordered on reverence, cleaning and bandaging the tiny wound with hands that trembled slightly against her skin. The contradiction fascinated her, the way this powerful being, who could probably tear apart armies, seemed undone by a few drops of her blood. "Why does my blood affect you so strongly?" The question had been building since that moment of intimate care, and now it emerged with the directness that wine and impossible circumstances had made possible. Darius froze at her words, his entire body going rigid as if she'd struck him with something more painful than any physical blow. For a long moment he said nothing, and she watched emotions flicker across his perfect features too quickly for her to identify. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries and secrets that had never been shared with mortal ears. "There are legends among my kind, stories passed down through generations about something called the mate bond." He moved to the wall of windows, staring out at the city lights that sparkled like fallen stars against the darkness. "Most vampires dismiss it as folklore, romantic nonsense created by those too weak to accept that we are solitary predators by nature. But the stories say that once in a millennium, perhaps once in 10 millennia, a vampire will encounter a human whose blood calls to them in ways that transcend mere hunger. The bond that forms is both blessing and curse, making the vampire protective to the point of madness, while rendering them vulnerable in ways our kind was never meant to be." Arya absorbed this information, connecting it to the way he'd looked at her in the elevator, the predatory focus mixed with something that bordered on worship. "You think I'm your mate?" she asked, surprised by how calm her voice sounded when her heart was racing with implications she was only beginning to understand. Darius turned from the window, and the expression on his face was raw with an honesty that made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "I know you are," he said simply. "The moment your scent reached me, centuries of control unraveled like smoke. I haven't fed properly in weeks because nothing else appeases the hunger anymore, nothing except the thought of you. The mate bond doesn't just create desire, Arya. It creates needs so fundamental that existence without the mate becomes meaningless." His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and she could see the way he fought against impulses she could only imagine. A mated vampire can be destroyed through their human partner. If you were to die, the bond would tear me apart from the inside. If you were to be hurt, tortured, used as leverage, I would do anything to protect you, sacrifice anything including my own kind. The weight of his words settled over her like a mantle she hadn't asked for, but somehow felt destined to wear. The intensity of what he was describing should have terrified her, but instead, she felt a strange sense of rightness, as if some part of her had been waiting her entire life for this moment of recognition. But there was something else nagging at the edges of her consciousness, details that suddenly seemed far more significant than they had hours ago. Marcus had been asking strange questions lately, she said slowly, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed beginning to click into place. About my family history, my bloodline, whether I knew anything about my great-grandmother's background. I thought he was just making conversation, maybe thinking about proposing and wanting to know about potential children, but he was always so insistent, especially when I told him I didn't know much about my mother's side of the family. Darius went very still at her words, and she could see his mind working behind those dark eyes, connections forming that painted a picture far more sinister than simple romantic curiosity. "What did you tell him about your family?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that made her skin prickle with foreboding. Arya moved toward the center of the room, trying to remember conversations that had seemed innocent at the time but now carried ominous weight. "Not much because there really isn't much to know," she said, wrapping her arms around herself as if warding off a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. "My mother died when I was young, and she never talked much about her family before that. All I knew was that my great-grandmother Elena came from Salem originally, immigrated sometime in the early 1700s. Marcus seemed particularly interested in that detail, kept asking if I'd ever researched the genealogy, whether Elena had left any records or artifacts behind. Darius's face had gone pale as marble, and when he spoke his voice carried the weight of terrible certainty. "Elena Blackwood," he said, and the name hung in the air between them like a spell waiting to be activated. "Your great-grandmother was Elena Blackwood, wasn't she?" Arya nodded, confused by his reaction, but increasingly certain that she was about to learn something that would change everything she thought she knew about herself. Darius moved to one of his antique desks, pulling out a leather-bound book that looked older than anything else in the apartment. He opened it carefully, pages crackling with age, until he found what he was searching for. "Elena Blackwood was one of the most powerful witches of her generation," he said, turning the book toward her so she could see the faded portrait on the yellowed page. "During the Salem trials, when fear and superstition were burning innocent women, Elena was part of a coven that allied themselves with local vampires for mutual protection. The witches provided magical wards and healing, while the vampires offered physical protection from the witch hunters. It was an alliance that saved hundreds of lives on both sides." Arya stared at the portrait, seeing her own features reflected in the woman's face. The same dark eyes and sharp cheekbones, the same stubborn set to the jaw that she recognized from looking in mirrors. "This is impossible," she whispered, but even as she said it, she knew it wasn't. Too many strange things had happened tonight. Too many impossible elements had aligned for her to dismiss this as coincidence. The woman in the portrait wore an expression of fierce intelligence and carefully controlled power, and looking at her felt like looking at a version of herself she'd never known existed. "Elena's bloodline carries dormant magical abilities," Darius continued, his voice gentle, but urgent. "The power usually skips generations, manifesting unpredictably, but it's always there waiting for the right catalyst to awaken it. A vampire mate bond can be exactly that catalyst." He closed the book carefully, as if it contained explosives rather than history. "If Marcus has connections to vampire hunters, if he knows what you are and what you could become, then tonight was never about forged artwork. You weren't his girlfriend, Arya. You were his assignment." The revelation hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making the room spin around her as everything she'd believed about the last 3 years crumbled into dust. Every kiss, every shared meal, every moment of intimacy, had been a lie designed to keep her close while he gathered information about her lineage and abilities. The man she'd trusted with her body and her heart had been preparing to sell her to people who would use her power against the very creatures she now found herself allied with. The sense of betrayal was so complete it felt like drowning, like being pulled beneath dark water with no hope of surfacing. Darius was beside her instantly, his cool hands framing her face as she struggled to process the magnitude of Marcus's deception. His touch anchored her to the present moment, providing stability while her world reconstructed itself around truths she'd never imagined. The mate bond hummed between them like electricity, and she could feel his fury on her behalf, the way her pain caused him actual physical anguish. It was overwhelming and comforting and terrifying all at once, this connection that made her emotions echo in someone else's soul. 3 years, she whispered, her voice breaking on the words. 3 years of lies, of him pretending to love me while he was really just cataloging everything he could use against me. How could I have been so blind? Darius's thumbs wiped away tears she hadn't realized were falling, his touch infinitely gentle despite the violence she could sense coiled in his muscles. Because you trusted as you were meant to trust, he said, his voice fierce with protective anger. Because you loved with an open heart, and there is no shame in that even when others prove unworthy of the gift. Marcus is the one who should bear the weight of this betrayal, not you. He manipulated and deceived someone precious beyond measure, and for that, he will answer to forces far more dangerous than human law. The promise in his words should have frightened her, but instead she felt a dark satisfaction at the thought of Marcus facing consequences for what he'd done. The man who'd spent years systematically destroying her confidence while secretly plotting to hand her over to people who would use her like a weapon deserved whatever justice Darius's world might provide. But there were larger implications to consider, dangers that extended far beyond personal betrayal. If I really do carry this dormant power, if the mate bond could awaken it, then I'm not just your vulnerability, she said, the understanding settling over her like a mantle of responsibility she hadn't asked for but felt compelled to accept. I'm a weapon that could be turned against your entire kind. The Order of the Silver Dawn. Victor mentioned, they're not just vampire hunters, are they? They're collecting people like me, witches with the right bloodlines, building an army to use against you. Darius nodded grimly, his hands still framing her face, as if he could protect her from the truth through touch alone. The Order has been growing in power for decades, recruiting hunters and collecting magical bloodlines for exactly that purpose. A witch with Elena Blackwood's lineage, awakened by a mate bond and trained to channel her power as a weapon, could devastate vampire communities across the world. They would use you to destroy everything I've spent centuries building, everyone I've sworn to protect. The weight of it was staggering, the knowledge that her very existence made her a target for forces she was only beginning to understand. But looking into Darius's eyes, seeing the way he watched her with a mixture of fierce protectiveness and desperate hope, she realized that she'd already made her choice. The moment she'd taken his hand in that elevator, she'd stepped across a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The safe, ordinary life she'd built for herself was gone, burned away by revelation and betrayal and a connection that transcended every rational boundary. Then we make sure they never get that chance, she said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. If I really am your mate, if this power is part of my heritage, then I choose how it gets used. I choose who it protects. And right now, I choose you. The security footage played across multiple screens in Darius's private study, each angle revealing another layer of Marcus's systematic betrayal as Arya watched 3 years of her life recontextualized into something monstrous and calculated. Camera feeds from her apartment building showed him entering with legitimate access codes while she was at work, moving through her personal space with the efficiency of someone conducting reconnaissance, rather than the casual familiarity of a concerned boyfriend. He planted devices with practiced precision, microscopic transmitters hidden in picture frames and jewelry boxes, cameras disguised as decorative elements that had been watching her most intimate moments for months. The violation was so complete it made her stomach clench with nauseous horror, but worse was the clinical detachment in his movements as he catalogued her belongings like inventory items, photographing family photos and personal documents with the methodical thoroughness of a professional operative. Victor stood beside the bank of monitors, his pale fingers dancing across keyboards as he pulled up additional feeds from traffic cameras and ATM security systems, tracking Marcus's movements through Manhattan with the kind of technical expertise that spoke of centuries spent adapting to technological advances. Each timestamp revealed another piece of the surveillance network that had been wrapped around Arya's life like a spider's web, connections she'd never suspected linking her daily routines to a larger pattern of observation and control. The Silver Dawn had been studying her for at least 2 years before Marcus ever introduced himself, identifying her workplace, her favorite restaurants, her friends and colleagues, building a comprehensive profile that included everything from her coffee preferences to her menstrual cycle. The scope of it was breathtaking and terrifying, the kind of thorough intelligence gathering that suggested resources and patience on an institutional level. Marcus himself appeared in the footage like a different person entirely, his familiar face transformed by an expression of cold professionalism that bore no resemblance to the charming art lover who'd swept her off her feet 3 years ago. When he thought no one was watching, the mask slipped completely, revealing someone calculating and predatory who moved through her life with the confidence of a hunter stalking prey. Phone records showed regular contact with numbers that traced back to shell companies and encrypted communication networks. Financial records revealed payments from sources that didn't officially exist, and travel logs documented trips to locations across the country where similar supernatural incidents had been reported in recent months. He wasn't just hunting her, Arya realized with growing horror. He was part of a nationwide operation targeting anyone with magical bloodlines. The Order of the Silver Dawn operated like a military organization disguised as a series of academic research foundations and historical preservation societies, their public face presenting scholarly interest in folklore and mythology, while their true purpose involved the systematic identification and elimination of supernatural threats to human dominance. Victor's research revealed a network spanning decades of careful infiltration into genealogical societies, universities with strong anthropology programs, and government agencies responsible for tracking immigration and census data. They had been building comprehensive databases of bloodlines with supernatural potential, cross-referencing historical records with modern genetic analysis to identify individuals like Arya, whose heritage carried dormant magical abilities that could be awakened and weaponized. The revelation that Marcus was an operative, rather than simply an abusive ex-boyfriend, changed everything about their situation, transforming a personal betrayal into an existential threat that extended far beyond individual safety. Darius called an emergency meeting of the Vampire Council within hours of confirming Marcus's true allegiances, summoning ancient beings who had ruled from shadows for millennia and rarely concerned themselves with matters involving individual humans. The council convened in a subterranean chamber beneath the city that predated European settlement, carved from living rock and warded with protective magic that made the air itself thrum with barely contained power. 7 vampires older than recorded history took their places around a table hewn from a single massive stone, their combined age representing over 10,000 years of accumulated knowledge and political maneuvering. Each council member embodied a different aspect of vampire culture and capability, from Evangeline Thorne, whose mastery of financial markets had built fortunes that funded their entire civilization, to Sebastian Ravencroft, whose network of information brokers knew every secret worth knowing in the modern world. They spoke in voices that carried the weight of centuries, debating Arya's fate with the clinical detachment of generals planning a military campaign where individual lives were acceptable losses in service of larger strategic goals. Some argued for elimination, claiming that removing her from the equation would eliminate the threat she represented to their carefully maintained secrecy. Others saw opportunity in the situation, proposing to use her as bait to draw Silver Dawn operatives into the open, where they could be systematically destroyed. Darius listened to their deliberations with growing fury that made the air around him shimmer with barely controlled violence, his protective instincts warring with political necessity, as beings he had considered allies debated whether to murder his mate for the greater good. When Counselor Blackwood suggested that a swift death would be merciful, compared to what the Silver Dawn had planned, Darius rose from his seat with predatory grace that silenced the chamber immediately. His voice carried absolute authority when he spoke, reminding them all that he commanded resources and loyalties that could destabilize their entire civilization if properly motivated. "Touch her, and I will bring war to your doorsteps," he said with the calm certainty of someone stating natural law rather than making threats. "I will burn this council to ash and rebuild it with beings who understand that some things are worth more than political expediency." The confrontation revealed how completely the mate bond had transformed him, from calculating political leader to desperate protector, willing to sacrifice everything for one human woman, and the other council members recognized the dangerous precedent this represented. A vampire consumed by mate bond madness could not be trusted to make rational decisions about supernatural security, but neither could he be easily controlled or eliminated without triggering exactly the kind of supernatural war they were trying to avoid. After hours of tense negotiation, they reached a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but offered the best chance of containing the current crisis while maintaining the fragile peace that kept their world hidden from human awareness. Victor revealed his own supernatural nature in the aftermath of the council meeting, dropping the careful human disguise he had maintained for Arya's benefit to show her the shapeshifter abilities that made him invaluable as both protector and intelligence gatherer. His true form shifted between human and something lupine, but not quite wolf, a creature of shadow and smoke that could pass through spaces no physical body should fit and hear conversations from impossible distances. He had been bound to serve Darius through magical compulsion for over 2 centuries, their partnership forged during the Industrial Revolution, when both had been younger and more willing to trust in permanent alliances. The binding made him incapable of betraying Darius directly, but also ensured absolute loyalty that extended to protecting anything Darius valued above his own existence. The supernatural world Victor described existed in layers beneath Manhattan like archaeological strata, each species maintaining their own territories and power structures while cooperating just enough to maintain the masquerade that kept them all hidden from human awareness. Vampire courts controlled the financial districts and luxury markets, werewolf packs claimed the industrial zones and shipping infrastructure, while witch covens maintained careful neutrality by providing magical services to all sides. The system had worked for centuries, through careful balance and mutual assured destruction, but the Silver Dawn threatened to upset that equilibrium by turning supernatural abilities against their own users. They had been systematically infiltrating each community, identifying key individuals with exploitable weaknesses or useful capabilities, building leverage that could be used to force cooperation or eliminate resistance. Arya discovered that her friend Sophia from the gallery had been hiding her own supernatural heritage, practicing hedge magic inherited from a grandmother who claimed Mediterranean gypsy bloodlines that carried far more literal truth than most people suspected. Sophia's abilities manifested as intuitive understanding of artistic authenticity and emotional resonance, allowing her to identify forgeries not through technical analysis but through psychic impression of the creator's intentions. She had been concealing these talents for years, passing off supernatural insight as professional expertise while carefully avoiding attention from anyone who might recognize what she truly was. The revelation that she had been practicing magic while helping Arya authenticate artwork added another layer of complexity to the situation, suggesting that the Silver Dawn might have been tracking multiple targets simultaneously. Together, Arya and Sophia began researching the Blackwood family history with resources Victor provided, uncovering records that painted a picture of inherited power stretching back through generations of women who had shaped history from the shadows. Elena Blackwood had been far more than simply a witch who survived the Salem trials. She had been instrumental in establishing the supernatural treaties that still governed interactions between species 3 centuries later. Her descendants had continued that legacy of magical diplomacy, working as mediators and peacekeepers until the bloodline went dormant in Arya's mother's generation. The power had been waiting for the right catalyst to reawaken it, and the mate bond with Darius was providing exactly that activation energy. But the Silver Dawn had been planning for this possibility, their operation revealing levels of preparation that suggested they understood the supernatural world far better than anyone had suspected. Marcus orchestrated a trap during Arya's gallery opening, an event that should have been safe neutral ground, where supernatural beings could interact with human society without raising suspicion. The guest list included collectors and artists from across the city, many of whom were supernatural beings using the art world as cover for their true activities. The Silver Dawn had identified them all, using social media analysis and financial tracking to build a comprehensive list of targets who would be present at the same location on the same evening. The poison they introduced into the champagne was a masterpiece of supernatural biochemistry, a compound that affected non-human metabolisms while leaving ordinary humans completely unharmed. They had been testing variations for months, using homeless populations and isolated supernatural individuals as unwitting test subjects, refining the formula until it could temporarily disable vampire reflexes, werewolf healing, and witch magical defenses without causing immediately obvious symptoms. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: poison the entire gathering, then identify and capture anyone who showed adverse reactions while maintaining plausible deniability about the cause. Darius arrived at the gallery to find Arya surrounded by Silver Dawn operatives disguised as wealthy art collectors, their evening wear concealing weapons specifically designed to incapacitate supernatural beings. The trap had been sprung with military precision, exits blocked by agents positioned to look like security guards, while the poisoned champagne had already begun affecting several guests who were struggling to hide their supernatural nature from human witnesses. The mate bond drove him to protective fury that overrode centuries of careful self-control, but the poison in the air was already weakening his usual advantages. When he saw Marcus approaching Arya with a syringe designed to deliver concentrated toxins directly into her bloodstream, rational thought evaporated completely. His partial transformation happened in full view of shocked socialites who had expected nothing more dangerous than pretentious conversation about abstract expressionism, fangs, extending as claws erupted from fingertips that had been perfectly manicured hours earlier. The masquerade that had protected supernatural society for centuries began crumbling as other affected beings dropped their human disguises in response to immediate threats. Werewolves shifting partially to access enhanced strength, while witches began casting defensive spells that made the air crackle with visible energy. The carefully maintained secret that allowed supernatural beings to exist alongside human society was dissolving into chaos, as cell phone cameras captured footage that would be impossible to explain or suppress, while Silver Dawn operatives abandoned subtlety in favor of open warfare against creatures they had been hunting from the shadows for decades. The gallery erupted into supernatural warfare as centuries of carefully maintained secrecy shattered like crystal under the weight of desperate survival. Cell phone cameras capturing footage that would rewrite humanity's understanding of the world they thought they knew. Darius's partial transformation sent shockwaves through the crowd of socialites who had expected nothing more dangerous than overpriced wine and pretentious conversation about postmodern sculpture. His fangs gleaming under track lighting as claws erupted from fingertips that had been signing million-dollar acquisition contracts hours earlier. The poisoned champagne had weakened him, but couldn't suppress the mate bond fury that drove him toward Arya like a force of nature. silver-armed operatives scattering before his advance until Marcus stepped between them with a weapon that made the air itself recoil. Sophia's hedge magic flared to life as she dropped her carefully maintained human facade, drawing power from the gallery's collection of artistic passion and creative energy to weave protective barriers around terrified civilians who were live streaming the impossible battle to social media platforms across the globe. Victor shifted into his true form, with predatory grace, shadow and smoke coalescing into something that was neither fully human nor entirely wolf, moving through the crowd like liquid darkness to engage Silver Dawn operatives who had trained for decades to hunt creatures exactly like him. The carefully orchestrated trap was dissolving into chaos, as supernatural beings throughout the crowd revealed their true natures in response to immediate threats. Werewolves accessing enhanced strength, while witches began casting spells that made reality bend around their intentions. But the Silver Dawn had prepared for this possibility, their weapons specifically designed to exploit supernatural weaknesses with surgical precision. Silver-laced nets deployed from concealed positions throughout the gallery, their blessed metal burning through vampire skin and disrupting magical energy flows, while electromagnetic pulse devices interfered with shapeshifter transformations. Marcus moved with military efficiency as he coordinated the operation, speaking into a throat microphone while directing operatives who had spent years studying their target's capabilities and limitations. The poison in the champagne was only the opening gambit of a strategy designed to expose and capture as many supernatural beings as possible in a single coordinated strike. Arya watched the battle unfold with growing horror as friends and colleagues revealed themselves to be either supernatural beings fighting for their lives or Silver Dawn operatives committed to their systematic destruction. The art authentication skills that had made her professional reputation suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the magical heritage awakening in her bloodstream, power stirring in response to Darius's danger and her own desperate need to protect what mattered most. When Marcus approached with a syringe designed to deliver concentrated toxins directly into her system, something ancient and protective flared to life within her chest. Elena Blackwood's legacy, responding to 3 centuries of dormancy with explosive force. The magical awakening hit her like lightning, channeled through human nervous systems, never designed to handle such voltage. Power burning through her veins, as her witch heritage responded to the mate bond's activation with abilities that had been waiting generations for the right catalyst. Fire erupted from her fingertips, without conscious direction, silver weapons melting under supernatural heat, while the poison affecting Darius began burning away under the influence of magic that transcended simple chemical compounds. But the effort was too much for a human body suddenly hosting powers that normally required years of careful training to control safely, and she felt herself collapsing as energy drained from her system faster than it could be replenished. Darius caught her falling form, even as silver nets wrapped around his limbs, the blessed metal burning through vampire flesh, while emergency response teams from all supernatural factions converged on the gallery to contain a situation that threatened to expose their entire hidden world. The masquerade was crumbling in real time as footage spread across internet platforms, human witnesses uploading videos of impossible creatures fighting with weapons that belonged in fantasy novels rather than Manhattan art galleries. Emergency protocols developed over centuries of careful secrecy were activating across the city as supernatural leaders scrambled to implement damage control measures that might preserve some vestige of their hidden existence. But it was too late for half measures and careful manipulation of human perception. The Silver Dawn had planned for exactly this exposure as part of their larger strategy to force supernatural beings into the open where they could be systematically hunted without the protection that secrecy had provided for millennia. Reinforcements arrived through entrances that had been carefully scouted and prepared, armed with weapons that could incapacitate even ancient vampires, while specialized containment units designed for supernatural prisoners were deployed with military efficiency. Victor's shadow form provided temporary advantage, But even his abilities couldn't overcome sheer numbers, backed by technology specifically designed to counter his strengths. While Sophia's magical defenses were overwhelmed by electromagnetic interference that disrupted her connection to the artistic energy she drew power from. The capture happened with brutal efficiency, despite the supernatural abilities arrayed against the Silver Dawn operatives, their decades of preparation and institutional resources proving superior to individual power when properly coordinated and applied. Darius found himself wrapped in blessed silver chains that burned through his skin while suppressing his vampire abilities, the mate bond screaming warnings through his nervous system as Arya was loaded into a containment unit designed to prevent magical energy from flowing through its blessed steel walls. Marcus supervised the operation with professional satisfaction, speaking calmly into his communication devices while coordinating extraction procedures that had been rehearsed countless times in preparation for exactly this scenario. The Silver Dawn facility, where they were imprisoned, existed in violation of numerous international treaties and human rights conventions, a black site operation funded through shell corporations and hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic obfuscation that made oversight impossible. The building had been constructed specifically for holding supernatural prisoners, every surface blessed or treated with substances that interfered with non-human abilities, while surveillance systems monitored their captives with technology that could detect the smallest fluctuation in magical energy. Arya and Darius were separated by barriers of consecrated silver that prevented not only physical contact, but disrupted the supernatural connection that bound them together, each isolated in cells designed to maximize psychological pressure while preventing any possibility of escape or communication. Marcus visited Arya's cell with the casual confidence of someone who had finally achieved a goal years in the making, his familiar face transformed by satisfaction that was both personal and professional. The revelation of his true feelings added another layer of psychological torture to her imprisonment, as he confessed that he had genuinely enjoyed aspects of their relationship despite its fundamentally deceptive nature. The sex had been pleasurable, he explained with clinical detachment, and her intelligence had made for stimulating conversation during the years he had spent cataloging her supernatural potential. But personal enjoyment was subordinate to institutional duty, and the Silver Dawn's mission to eliminate supernatural threats took precedence over any individual attachments he might have developed during the operation. The choice he offered her was designed to exploit the mate bond in the cruelest possible way, using her love for Darius as leverage to secure cooperation in developing weapons that would be used to systematically eliminate his entire species. Cooperate in providing blood samples and magical energy for their research programs, and Darius would be executed quickly with minimal suffering. Refuse, and they would torture him for centuries, using her emotional anguish as additional torment, the mate bond ensuring that every moment of his pain would echo through her own nervous system. The offer was presented as mercy wrapped in cruelty, forcing her to choose between immediate sacrifice and prolonged agony for the being she had come to love more than her own existence. The blessed silver barriers that separated them couldn't entirely suppress the mate bond, though they weakened it to whispers rather than the symphony of connection they had shared during their brief time together. Through that attenuated link, Darius communicated absolute love and complete willingness to die, rather than see her enslaved by people who would use her abilities to destroy everything they both valued. His mental voice carried centuries of experience with difficult choices and political necessities, but also something deeper and more fundamental than mere strategy. He would rather cease existing than live in a world where her freedom had been sacrificed for his survival, the mate bond making clear that her welfare mattered more to him than his own continued existence. The depth of his sacrifice and the purity of his love for her awakened something in Arya's bloodstream that had been dormant since Elena Blackwood's generation, magical potential responding not to training or conscious effort, but to emotional extremity that transcended rational thought. Power flowed through her nervous system like molten gold, burning away the effects of imprisonment and blessed silver while connecting her to magical traditions that stretched back through centuries of women who had shaped history from the shadows. The awakening was different from her desperate defensive response at the gallery, controlled rather than explosive, purposeful rather than instinctive. The Silver Dawn surveillance systems registered massive magical energy fluctuations in her cell, but couldn't identify their source or nature, the blessed containment field suddenly seeming inadequate against power that operated on principles their technology hadn't been designed to counter. Arya felt Elena Blackwood's memories stirring at the edges of her consciousness, 300 years of magical knowledge and political understanding becoming available to her awareness, like files being downloaded into human consciousness. The witch heritage that Marcus had spent years trying to catalog and exploit was revealing itself to be far more complex and dangerous than their research had, indicated power that couldn't be contained by mere physical barriers once properly awakened. Marcus returned to find her cell filled with energy that made the air itself luminous, his confident demeanor flickering as instruments designed to monitor supernatural activity registered readings that exceeded their maximum parameters. The woman he had spent 3 years studying and manipulating was transforming before his eyes, her human limitations burning away under the influence of magical inheritance that had been waiting centuries for the proper catalyst. When she looked at him, her eyes held depths that belonged to someone far older than her mortal years. Elena Blackwood's wisdom and power flowing through her descendants' consciousness like water filling a previously empty vessel. The mate bond that connected her to Darius flared beyond the ability of blessed silver to suppress, their connection becoming something that transcended physical barriers and magical interference through the sheer intensity of emotion and shared purpose. Through that link, she felt his wonder and fierce pride as he recognized the magnitude of her awakening, understanding that the woman he had fallen in love with was revealing herself to be far more powerful than either of them had suspected. The Silver Dawn had made a critical error in their calculations, assuming that dormant magical ability could be controlled through conventional means once awakened, failing to account for the possibility that some bloodlines carried power that existed beyond their ability to contain or comprehend. The facility's containment protocols were failing in real time, as Arya's magical awakening interacted with systems designed to suppress supernatural abilities rather than contain them. Blessed silver beginning to corrode under exposure to energy that operated according to principles older than the religious traditions used to consecrate their materials. Emergency alerts echoed through corridors, designed to hold the most dangerous supernatural prisoners on Earth. While Marcus realized with growing alarm that their carefully planned operation was about to become a catastrophic failure that would expose their entire organization to retribution from beings they had underestimated. The witch heritage they had tried to exploit was revealing itself to be a force of nature that their human limitations couldn't hope to control. 3 centuries of dormant power awakening with the fury of someone whose loved ones had been threatened by people too ignorant to understand the magnitude of their mistake. The silver barriers that had contained Arya's power for what felt like an eternity suddenly felt fragile as paper against the torrent of energy building within her bloodstream, the dormant magic of her Blackwood heritage responding to the mate bond's amplification like a symphony finding its crescendo. The pain of the silver poisoning that had racked her body for hours transformed into something else entirely, a burning sensation that spread through her veins like liquid starlight, connecting her to power sources she had never known existed. Every breath drew in more energy from the ancient ley lines that ran beneath the Silver Dawn facility, while every heartbeat sent waves of magical force radiating outward from her body, in patterns that made the air itself shimmer with barely contained potential. The silver chains that bound her to the chair began to smoke and crack as her power found its voice. The metal that had seemed unbreakable moments before, now nothing more than an irritating constraint against forces that had been building for generations. Marcus stood over her with the expression of a scientist observing a particularly fascinating experiment, his face lit by the glow emanating from her skin as magical energy sought release through whatever channels it could find. He had spent 3 years studying her, cataloging every emotional response and physical reaction, but nothing in his research had prepared him for the sheer magnitude of power that lay dormant in her Blackwood bloodline. The Silver Dawn's instruments screamed warnings as energy readings climbed beyond anything their equipment had been designed to measure, while the carefully controlled environment of the laboratory began to buckle under pressure that defied every law of physics their organization understood. The other prisoners in their silver-lined cells began to stir as Arya's awakening power interfered with the constraints that held them captive, werewolves feeling their strength return, while vampires sensed their supernatural abilities surging back to full potency. Darius hung suspended in his own containment unit, silver chains wrapped around his wrists and ankles, while liquid silver dripped steadily into his bloodstream through intravenous tubes. But even through the haze of pain and chemical suppression, he could feel the mate bond flaring to life like a beacon in the darkness. Arya's awakening power called to something fundamental in his vampire nature. Not just the protective instincts that had driven him to madness over the past weeks, but something deeper and more primal. A connection that transcended species and transformed two separate beings into something greater than the sum of their individual parts. The silver that should have kept him helpless began to lose its effectiveness as her magic wrapped around him like armor, protecting him from the worst effects of the poisoning while channeling strength directly into his supernatural abilities. The explosion of power that erupted from Arya's body shattered every piece of silver in the facility simultaneously, the metal dissolving into harmless dust as her magic rewrote the fundamental properties of the elements that had been used to contain supernatural beings for centuries. Chains snapped like spiderwebs, cell doors burst from their hinges, and the carefully constructed prison that had held dozens of captured supernatural beings crumbled into ruins as power flowed through the building's structure like a cleansing fire. Vampires staggered to their feet with renewed strength coursing through their veins. Werewolves shifted into their most powerful forms as the silver poisoning fled their systems, and witches who had been drained to the point of death suddenly found themselves connected to energy sources that made their previous abilities seem like candles compared to suns. Marcus stumbled backward from the chair, where Arya sat wreathed in light that hurt to look at directly, his scientific detachment finally cracking into genuine terror as he realized that his organization had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of what they were dealing with. The Silver Dawn had spent decades studying supernatural beings as if they were simply animals with unusual abilities, cataloging their weaknesses and developing weapons to exploit them, without ever truly comprehending the vast networks of power and alliance that connected the supernatural world into something approaching a unified civilization. They had captured individual specimens without understanding that awakening a witch of Elena Blackwood's lineage would send ripples of magical energy across the continent, alerting every supernatural community to the location and nature of their operation. Darius freed himself from his restraints with vampire strength, amplified by Arya's magic flowing through their mate bond, the silver chains parting like tissue paper as power that had been building for centuries finally found proper expression. He moved toward her with inhuman speed, but instead of the desperate rescue he had been planning, he found himself joining a battle that was already turning in their favor. Arya rose from the chair that had held her captive, power crackling around her like visible lightning as she extended her consciousness to touch every supernatural being in the facility. Her magic enhanced their natural abilities while providing tactical coordination that allowed them to fight as a unified force rather than individual prisoners seeking escape. The Silver Dawn operatives, who had seemed so confident in their technological superiority, suddenly found themselves facing opponents whose capabilities exceeded every parameter in their databases. vampires moving with speed that defied measurement, while werewolves demonstrated strength that could tear through reinforced steel like cardboard. But it was the combination of Arya's magic with Darius's tactical experience that proved most devastating to their captors, her power channeling through his protective instincts to create effects that neither could have achieved alone. When he struck out against Silver Dawn agents, her magic amplified the force of his blows while guiding them toward maximum effectiveness. When she cast spells to disable their weapons and communication systems, his centuries of combat experience helped her target the most critical vulnerabilities. Victor led the other freed prisoners in a coordinated assault that transformed their escape into a full-scale battle for control of the facility, his shapeshifter abilities allowing him to scout ahead while relaying tactical information to supernatural beings who were discovering that their time in captivity had only made them more dangerous once released. The werewolf pack that had been captured during a raid in Central Park fought with coordinated precision that turned Silver Dawn corridors into hunting grounds, while a coven of witches who had been imprisoned for months began systematically dismantling the technological infrastructure that had kept them trapped. The facility that had seemed like an impregnable fortress hours earlier was rapidly becoming a death trap for the very people who had built it. But Marcus had prepared for the possibility of total containment failure, his paranoid nature leading him to install fail-safes that would ensure no supernatural prisoners could escape to reveal the Silver Dawn's existence to the outside world. As the last of his operatives fell to the coordinated assault of freed supernatural beings, he triggered explosives that had been built into the facility's foundation, enough C4 to level the entire building and everyone inside it. The countdown began with mechanical inevitability, 60 seconds that would end with the destruction of evidence and witnesses alike, a final solution that would preserve organizational security even at the cost of his own life and the lives of every Silver Dawn agent still in the building. The tremors that shook the facility, as the first charges detonated, sent cracks racing through reinforced walls, while emergency lighting flickered and died as power systems overloaded under the stress of systematic destruction. Darius felt the mate bond screaming at him to choose Arya above all other considerations, to use his supernatural speed to carry her to safety, regardless of what happened to the other prisoners who had fought beside them. But 6 centuries as a vampire king had trained him to think in terms of protecting communities rather than individuals, and the dozens of supernatural beings who looked to him for leadership represented responsibilities that predated his connection to Arya by hundreds of years. The impossible choice tore at him with physical pain as duty warred against instinct, political necessity against emotional need. Arya sensed his internal struggle through their bond, and made the decision before conscious thought could paralyze them both. Her magic surging outward to create a protective barrier around the other supernatural prisoners, while her hands pushed against his chest with surprising strength. The shield she conjured was a masterwork of inherited Blackwood power, drawing on leyline energy from across the continent to create a protective dome that could theoretically withstand the coming explosion, but maintaining it would require every ounce of magical energy she possessed, and probably more besides. She was prepared to die to save beings she barely knew, supernatural strangers who had been imprisoned alongside her, because saving them was the right thing to do regardless of personal cost. Darius refused to leave her, even as the building shook with approaching destruction, his vampire nature rebelling against the very concept of abandoning his mate to face death alone. Instead of fleeing to safety, he poured his own supernatural strength into her protective spell, their combined power creating something that transcended the individual capabilities of either vampire or witch. The mate bond that had made them vulnerable to each other's pain now became a conduit for shared strength, amplifying their abilities in ways that defied every law of supernatural physics. Her magic wrapped around his vampire nature, while his protective instincts guided her power toward maximum efficiency, creating a fusion of abilities that had never existed before in recorded supernatural history. The explosion that should have vaporized the facility instead encountered a barrier of pure will, made manifest, magical energy reinforced by vampire strength and focused by centuries of tactical experience into something that could turn destruction back upon itself. But rather than simply surviving the blast, their combined power transformed the Silver Dawn's weapon into something unprecedented, a beacon of supernatural energy that blazed across the psychic spectrum, like a signal fire calling every supernatural being within 100 miles to their location. The facility that had been hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic camouflage and technological stealth suddenly became visible to every vampire court, werewolf pack, and witch coven in the tri-state area as a source of magical energy that demanded investigation. The rescue that arrived within minutes of the explosion made the earlier battle seem like a minor skirmish by comparison, as supernatural beings from across the region converged on the facility with coordinated precision that spoke of communication networks the Silver Dawn had never suspected. Vampire elders who had not left their strongholds in decades materialized from shadows that shouldn't have been deep enough to hide them, while werewolf alphas led their packs through the ruined building with predatory efficiency that left no Silver Dawn operative unaccounted for. Witch covens that had maintained careful neutrality for generations put aside their differences to help heal the wounded and catalog the evidence of systematic supernatural persecution that would require coordinated response. Marcus died in the ruins of his life's work, crushed beneath rubble that had once been state-of-the-art containment facilities designed to hold creatures he had never truly understood. His final expression was one of bewildered horror as he realized that his organization's greatest success had become the catalyst for their complete destruction, that capturing and studying Arya Blackwood had awakened powers that would reshape the balance between human and supernatural worlds forever. The Silver Dawn would not survive the revelation of their existence to the supernatural communities they had been hunting, their carefully hidden facilities across the country now blazing like beacons to beings whose patience with human persecution had finally reached its limit. Arya and Darius emerged from the wreckage changed by their shared experience. The mate bond that had once seemed like a vulnerability, now revealed as a source of strength that transcended anything either species had achieved alone. Her Blackwood heritage had awakened not just to its full potential, but to possibilities that even Elena's generation had never imagined, while his vampire nature had evolved beyond the limitations that had defined his kind for millennia. Together they represented something new in the supernatural world, a fusion of abilities that pointed toward a future where the artificial boundaries between species might become obsolete in favor of partnerships based on complementary strengths rather than territorial competition. The revelation of the supernatural world to humanity unfolded not with the mass hysteria that centuries of secrecy had been designed to prevent, but with a complex spectrum of reactions that reflected the full range of human nature when confronted with undeniable proof that their understanding of reality had been fundamentally incomplete. News footage from the gallery battle and the Silver Dawn facility destruction spread across social media platforms faster than any government could hope to contain. Cell phone videos showing vampires moving with impossible speed and witches wielding power that made physics textbooks obsolete. While werewolf transformations were captured in high definition and analyzed frame by millions of viewers who could no longer dismiss such evidence as elaborate special effects. The initial 24 hours brought chaos as stock markets crashed. Religious leaders struggled to reconcile supernatural existence with established doctrine, and emergency services found themselves dealing with everything from vampire attacks by opportunistic criminals wearing plastic fangs to genuine supernatural beings coming forward to register with authorities who had no protocols for processing their existence. But humanity's response to the supernatural revelation proved more nuanced than anyone had anticipated, splitting roughly into three primary factions that would define the political landscape for years to come. The first group, comprising perhaps 30% of the population, reacted with fear and revulsion, that quickly organized itself into movements demanding government action to contain or eliminate supernatural threats. Their terror amplified by religious extremists who declared the revelation a sign of approaching apocalypse, and political opportunists who saw supernatural beings as convenient scapegoats for existing social problems. The second faction, slightly larger at around 35%, approached the revelation with fascination rather than fear, eager to learn about supernatural cultures and abilities that had existed alongside humanity for millennia without their knowledge, their curiosity driving research initiatives and cultural exchange programs that would have been impossible under the old paradigm of enforced secrecy. The remaining 35% of humanity fell somewhere between these extremes, approaching the supernatural revelation with cautious acceptance while demanding legal frameworks to ensure peaceful coexistence between species that had radically different capabilities and needs. Arya found herself uniquely positioned to serve as a bridge between these worlds, her gallery transforming almost overnight from an exclusive venue for wealthy art collectors into a cultural center where human and supernatural artists collaborated on works that explored themes impossible before the revelation. Her Blackwood heritage made her a figure of respect within supernatural communities, while her human upbringing allowed her to communicate with scared or confused humans in ways that pure supernatural beings often could not. The space that had once showcased traditional paintings and sculptures now featured interactive magical installations, werewolf sculptures that shifted form in response to lunar cycles, and vampire photography that captured light spectrums invisible to human vision. These collaborative works became symbols of possibility rather than threat, demonstrating that supernatural abilities could enrich human culture rather than replace it, while providing economic opportunities that gave both communities incentives for peaceful coexistence. Darius channeled his centuries of political experience and accumulated wealth into establishing legal frameworks that would protect supernatural beings while addressing legitimate human concerns about integration, working with government officials who were scrambling to develop policies for situations no law school had ever prepared them to handle. His vampire court's financial resources, accumulated over 600 years of careful investment and political maneuvering, became the foundation for lobbying efforts that pushed for supernatural rights legislation while funding research into technologies that could help monitor supernatural populations without restricting their freedoms. The legal status of beings who could live for millennia, possessed superhuman abilities, or operated according to magical rather than scientific principles required entirely new categories of jurisprudence, while questions of citizenship, taxation, and voting rights for creatures who might predate the founding of the nation itself created constitutional crises that would take decades to fully resolve. Their love story became a symbol of hope for supernatural human relationships that had previously been forced to exist in shadows and secrecy, inspiring other mixed couples to come forward and seek legal recognition for bonds that human law had never acknowledged. Marriage certificates that listed species alongside names, adoption procedures for supernatural children being raised by human families, and inheritance laws that accounted for the extreme longevity differences between species, all required legislative innovation on scales unprecedented in human history. Arya and Darius appeared before congressional committees and United Nations assemblies, testifying about the possibilities for peaceful coexistence, while demonstrating through their own relationship that love could transcend biological differences without requiring either party to abandon their fundamental nature. But not every enemy had been eliminated in the Silver Dawn facility explosion, and Marcus had escaped in the chaos of supernatural beings converging on the building from across the tri-state area, his survival instincts and paranoid preparation allowing him to slip away while his organization crumbled around him. The revelation that supernatural beings possess the numbers, organization, and power to coordinate such a massive response to threats against their community had terrified government factions who realized that humanity's assumed dominance over the planet was based on ignorance rather than actual superiority. Marcus found new backing from military contractors and intelligence agencies who saw supernatural beings as existential threats requiring immediate and decisive action, while foreign governments began developing their own anti-supernatural programs based on Silver Dawn research that had been distributed through international intelligence networks. The 6 months following the revelation passed in a whirlwind of political negotiations, cultural exchanges, and personal growth as both Arya and Darius adapted to lives lived entirely in public view, their every action scrutinized by media outlets eager to document how the most famous supernatural human couple in the world navigated their relationship. Arya's magical abilities continued to develop under the guidance of witch elders, who emerged from hiding to help train Elena Blackwood's heir, while Darius found himself serving as an unofficial ambassador between vampire courts and human governments, who were struggling to understand the complex political structures that had governed supernatural society for millennia. Their penthouse became a neutral meeting ground where supernatural leaders could interact with human officials without the security concerns that plagued more traditional diplomatic venues, while their relationship served as proof that cooperation between species was possible, despite fundamental differences in nature and capabilities. The mating ceremony they planned would combine vampire ritual with witch traditions in ways that had never been attempted before, creating new forms of magical binding that could strengthen not only their personal bond, but the communities they represented. Vampire ceremonies traditionally took place at midnight under the dark moon, emphasizing the eternal nature of undead commitment and the power that flowed through darkness and shadow, while witch rituals were typically performed at dawn or sunset, when the veil between worlds was thinnest and magical energies could be most easily channeled. The compromise they reached would begin at sunset and continue through the night until dawn, allowing both traditions to be honored while creating something entirely new that reflected their unique position as bridges between worlds. Victor served as best man, despite his own complicated feelings about the public exposure of supernatural society, his loyalty to Darius overcoming his preference for the anonymity that had protected shapeshifters for generations. While Sophia stood as Arya's maid of honor, even as her own tentative romance with the werewolf Alpha developed against the backdrop of their friend's very public relationship. The guest list included supernatural beings who had not attended the same social function in centuries alongside human dignitaries who were still adjusting to the reality of sharing their world with creatures they had thought mythological weeks earlier. Security for the event required coordination between human law enforcement and supernatural protection details, creating protocols that would serve as templates for future mixed-species gatherings. The ceremony itself took place on the penthouse rooftop overlooking a Manhattan skyline that now openly acknowledged its supernatural residents, vampire-owned businesses operating with licenses that listed their true nature. While werewolf pack territories were legally recognized by city planning committees that had never imagined needing to account for lunar transformation cycles in their zoning decisions. As Arya and Darius exchanged vows that had been crafted to honor both their individual natures and their shared commitment to building something new together, their combined power created a spectacular display of light and energy that was visible across all 5 boroughs. Her magic wrapped around his vampire nature in patterns that made the air itself luminous, while his protective instincts channeled her power into configurations that strengthened the mate bond beyond anything either species had previously achieved. The light show that accompanied their binding became a celebration for the entire city as supernatural beings across the region felt the resonance of their union through psychic networks that connected their communities, while humans gathered on rooftops and in parks to witness magic being performed openly, for perhaps the first time in recorded history. The energy patterns they created together rewrote the fundamental nature of both vampire and witch magic, establishing new possibilities for cooperation between supernatural species that had previously maintained careful separation to avoid conflicts over territory and resources. Their marriage represented not just personal commitment, but political alliance between communities that would shape the future of supernatural human coexistence for generations to come. But even as they danced together on the rooftop with the city sparkling below them, shadows gathered around the edges of their newfound happiness in the form of enemies who would never accept the new world order that their love had helped create. During the reception, as supernatural and human guests mingled with cautious enthusiasm while learning to navigate social interactions that had no historical precedent, a messenger arrived with an envelope bearing the Silver Dawn seal that should have been destroyed with their organization weeks earlier. The single word contained within promised that their enemies had survived and regrouped with new backing from forces that viewed supernatural human cooperation as an existential threat requiring immediate elimination. Marcus had spent the months since his escape building new alliances with military contractors and government factions, who shared his view that supernatural beings represented an invasion force that needed to be repelled before they could establish permanent footholds in human society. His personal vendetta against Arya and Darius, now backed by institutional resources that dwarfed the original Silver Dawn's capabilities. International intelligence networks had distributed his research to foreign governments, who were developing their own anti-supernatural programs, while domestic military units trained with weapons designed to exploit supernatural weaknesses on scales that could turn entire cities into battlegrounds. The revelation of the supernatural world had not ended the conflict, but simply moved it from shadows into daylight, where the stakes were exponentially higher. The quiet moment as Arya and Darius swayed together in the aftermath of their ceremony, her head resting against his shoulder, while the city lights twinkled below them like earthbound stars, represented both an ending and a beginning, as their love story evolved from personal romance into political symbol for the possibility of peace between worlds that had been at war for centuries without most participants even knowing the conflict existed. Their bond had survived capture, torture, and the revelation of their existence to an entire planet, emerging stronger for having been tested under conditions that would have destroyed lesser connections. Whatever challenges the future held, whatever enemies emerged from the shadows cast by their happiness, they would face them as partners whose love had already transformed the fundamental nature of the world they shared. The promise contained in that final dance was not that their lives would be easy or safe, but that they would face whatever came next together, their combined strength greater than the sum of their individual parts, their love a bright flame against gathering darkness that would illuminate the path toward a future where supernatural and human could coexist not in the shadows of secrecy, but in the full light of acknowledged truth and mutual respect. Even as ancient enemies prepared new wars against the peace they represented,